The American Revolution was more than a colonial rebellion. It was the spark that lit the birth of a nation destined to reshape the world. From 13 struggling colonies rose a power that would one day dominate the global stage. Discover how the American Revolution gave birth to a superpower. Subscribe now for more untold history. The American Revolution, 1775 to 1783, was not only a defining chapter in the history of the United States, but also a transformative event in global history. What began as a colonial struggle for independence from Britain grew into a movement that reshaped political thought, international alliances, and the course of modern democracy. It was more than a war. It was the birth of a new political experiment that would inspire people across continents to challenge monarchy, tyranny, and entrenched systems of privilege. The revolution mattered because it introduced a radical idea that government exists to serve the people, not the other way around. The Declaration of Independence, with its principles of liberty, equality, and the right to self-determination, echoed far beyond North America. It directly influenced the French Revolution in 1789, inspired Latin American independence movements led by figures like Simón Bolívar, and encouraged debates about freedom and rights in Europe, Africa, and Asia. The success of a group of relatively small colonies against the world's strongest empire demonstrated that change was possible, even against overwhelming odds. On the global stage, the revolution altered power balances. France's support for the American cause weakened Britain's empire and laid the groundwork for future rivalries. It also set the United States on the path to becoming a new power whose economic and political influence would shape the modern world. At the same time, the revolution exposed contradictions. While it preached liberty, slavery persisted, and Native Americans and women were excluded from the promise of equality. These tensions would define future struggles for rights and justice. Ultimately, the American Revolution matters in world history because it was the spark that helped ignite an age of revolutions, embedding the ideals of freedom, democracy, and self-rule into the global consciousness. The American Revolution did not erupt suddenly in 1775. It was the product of deep-rooted political, economic, social, and intellectual tensions that developed over decades. Politically, the colonies grew resentful of Britain's increasing control. The idea of no taxation without representation became central as colonists argued they were being taxed by a parliament in which they had no elected voice. Acts such as the Stamp Act, 1765, the Townshend Duties, 1767, and the Coercive Acts, 1774, reinforced the sense that Britain was stripping away colonial self-government. Royal governors often clashed with local assemblies, fueling distrust of imperial authority. Economically, Britain imposed strict mercantilist policies to ensure the colonies served as a source of raw materials and a market for British goods. The Navigation Acts restricted colonial trade, and new taxes placed financial burdens on merchants and farmers. Many colonists believed their economic growth was being stifled to benefit Britain's empire. The Tea Act of 1773, which granted the British East India Company monopoly privileges, directly triggered protests like the Boston Tea Party. Socially, a distinct American identity was emerging. Colonists, separated by an ocean from Britain, developed their own institutions, religious practices, and communities. The frontier experience encouraged self-reliance, while population growth created a dynamic society less tied to aristocratic traditions. The widening gap between colonists and the British elite fostered feelings of independence. Intellectually, Enlightenment ideas profoundly shaped revolutionary thought. Thinkers like John Locke argued that governments derive power from the consent of the governed, and that individuals possess natural rights to life, liberty, and property. Colonial leaders such as Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and Thomas Paine drew heavily from these philosophies, applying them to their struggle against Britain. Together, these political grievances, economic restrictions, social changes, and Enlightenment ideals created the fertile ground for revolution, a movement not just for independence, but for a new vision of governance. In the mid-18th century, the 13 British colonies in North America were diverse, prosperous, and increasingly self-reliant. Stretching from New England to Georgia, these colonies varied in culture, religion, and economy. New England thrived on trade, fishing, and small-scale farming. The middle colonies prospered through commerce and mixed agriculture, while the southern colonies relied heavily on plantation systems and enslaved labor. Despite these differences, colonists shared common experiences of self-government through local assemblies, religious pluralism, and a growing sense of independence from Britain. However, tensions with the British Crown escalated after the French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763. Britain had won vast new territories in North America, but also accumulated immense debt. To recover financially and secure the colonies, London turned to taxation and stricter imperial control. Colonists, who had long enjoyed relative autonomy under salutary neglect, viewed these measures as an infringement on their rights. The Stamp Act of 1765 marked the first direct tax imposed on colonists, requiring payment on newspapers, legal documents, and other printed goods. It sparked widespread resistance, including riots, boycotts, and the formation of the Sons of Liberty. The uproar forced Britain to repeal the act, but Parliament quickly reinforced its authority through the Declaratory Act, affirming its right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. Economic tensions deepened with the Townshend Acts of 1767, which taxed imports like glass, paper, and tea. Colonists responded with organized boycotts and increased smuggling, demonstrating their ability to unite across regions. The situation turned violent with the Boston Massacre in 1770, when British soldiers fired into a crowd, killing 5 colonists. This incident became a rallying point against tyranny. The Crown's attempt to rescue the struggling East India Company through the Tea Act of 1773 further inflamed resentment, as colonists saw it as favoritism toward British interests. The Boston Tea Party, in which colonists dumped tea into the harbor, prompted harsh reprisals. The Coercive Acts of 1774, dubbed the Intolerable Acts. These laws closed Boston's port, restricted self-government, and allowed British troops to be quartered in colonial homes. By the mid-1770s, colonial society was deeply polarized. Loyalists sought to preserve ties with Britain, but patriots increasingly demanded independence. The combination of economic burdens, political repression, and British arrogance turned local disputes into a revolutionary struggle that would soon engulf all 13 colonies. The road to rebellion in the American colonies began long before open fighting in 1775. The French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763, was the first major turning point. Britain's victory over France secured control of North America, but left the empire with staggering war debts and new territorial responsibilities. To manage these, Britain sought greater revenue from the colonies, ending the long-standing policy of salutary neglect. Colonists, who had grown accustomed to self-rule and economic freedom, saw this shift as an attack on their liberties. The first flashpoints came with the Sugar Act, 1764, and the Stamp Act, 1765. Both imposed direct taxes on goods and printed materials, sparking widespread outrage. Colonists argued taxation without representation violated their rights as Englishmen. The organized protests, boycotts, and creation of the Sons of Liberty signaled the birth of a revolutionary spirit. Although Britain repealed the Stamp Act, the Declaratory Act reaffirmed Parliament's supremacy, keeping tensions alive. Next came the Townshend Acts, 1767, which taxed everyday imports such as glass, paint, and tea. Resistance escalated, with colonial merchants uniting in boycotts. Britain stationed troops in Boston to enforce order, leading to violent clashes like the Boston Massacre of 1770, where 5 colonists were killed. Patriot leaders used the event as propaganda to rally anti-British sentiment. The final spark before full-scale rebellion was the Tea Act of 1773, which gave the East India Company monopoly control over tea sales in the colonies. Though the act lowered tea prices, colonists saw it as a trick to force acceptance of unjust taxation. In defiance, patriots disguised as Native Americans staged the Boston Tea Party, dumping British tea into the harbor. This dramatic act of resistance convinced Britain to impose the harsh, intolerable acts, pushing the colonies from protest to the brink of revolution. By 1775, tensions between Britain and its American colonies had reached a breaking point. The intolerable acts had united the colonies in resistance, and the First Continental Congress had called for boycotts and petitions. But compromise seemed unlikely. Britain saw colonial defiance as rebellion, while colonists increasingly viewed British authority as tyranny. The spark of war came in Massachusetts, where revolutionary sentiment was strongest. In April 1775, British General Thomas Gage ordered troops to march from Boston to Lexington and Concord, to seize colonial weapons and arrest Patriot leaders. On April 19th, the British met resistance from colonial militia, known as Minutemen, on the Lexington Green. Though only a few shots were fired, they became immortalized as the shot heard round the world. The British pressed on to Concord, where a larger force of militia confronted them. Facing unexpected resistance, the British retreated toward Boston under constant fire from armed colonists hiding along the roads. This clash marked the official outbreak of armed conflict. In the weeks that followed, thousands of colonial militiamen surrounded Boston, beginning the siege of Boston. Battles such as Bunker Hill, June 1775, showed that while the colonists were inexperienced, they were determined and capable of inflicting heavy losses on the world's most powerful army. At the same time, the Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia, taking steps toward unifying the colonies by creating the Continental Army and appointing George Washington as its commander. The final break with Britain came in 1776. Despite efforts by some to seek reconciliation, such as the Olive Branch Petition, King George III rejected compromise and declared the colonies in open rebellion. Influenced by Thomas Paine's pamphlet Common Sense, which argued passionately for independence, momentum grew rapidly for a formal separation. On July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, authored primarily by Thomas Jefferson. The document proclaimed the colony's right to self-government, asserting that all men are endowed with natural rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This bold declaration transformed a colonial uprising into a revolutionary war for independence, an event that would echo across the world as the birth of a new nation. The Revolutionary War was marked by pivotal campaigns that shaped its outcome. Among these, Saratoga, Valley Forge, and Yorktown stand out as defining turning points in the struggle for American independence. The Battle of Saratoga, 1777, was the first major American victory and a crucial turning point. British General John Burgoyne planned to cut New England off from the rest of the colonies by advancing from Canada, but his army became trapped in upstate New York. American forces under General Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold decisively defeated the British at Saratoga. The victory convinced France that the Americans could win, leading to a formal alliance that brought French troops, naval power, and resources into the war. Without this alliance, independence would have been far less likely. The winter at Valley Forge, 1777 to 1778, tested the endurance of George Washington's army. Soldiers suffered from hunger, disease, and lack of supplies, with thousands dying in the harsh conditions. Yet Valley Forge became a symbol of resilience. Under the training of Baron von Steuben, a Prussian officer, the Continental Army emerged more disciplined and professional, better prepared to confront British forces in the field. The decisive moment came with the Battle of Yorktown, 1781. British General Charles Cornwallis entrenched his army on the Virginia coast, expecting evacuation by the Royal Navy. However, the French fleet under Admiral de Grasse blocked escape by sea, while Washington and French General Rochambeau coordinated a land siege. After weeks of bombardment, Cornwallis surrendered his army of over 7,000 men. Yorktown effectively ended major fighting as Britain realized the war was unwinnable. Together, Saratoga, Valley Forge, and Yorktown highlighted the resilience of the American cause, the importance of foreign alliances, and the leadership that secured independence. The American Revolution was not fought in isolation. Foreign involvement was decisive in transforming a colonial rebellion into a global conflict. Most crucial was the alliance with France, secured after the American victory at Saratoga in 1777. France, eager to weaken its old rival Britain, signed the Treaty of Alliance in 1778, formally recognizing American independence and committing military and financial support. French troops and naval forces proved vital, with figures like the Marquis de Lafayette strengthening the Continental Army and the French fleet playing a decisive role at Yorktown. Spain, though not formally allied with the United States, joined the war in 1779 as a partner of France. Spain aimed to recover territories lost to Britain, particularly Florida and Gibraltar. Spanish campaigns in the Gulf Coast and the Mississippi Valley diverted British forces and resources, indirectly aiding the American cause. Bernardo de Galvez, the Spanish governor of Louisiana, led successful operations against British forts, securing the Mississippi River for the Patriots. Other European powers also shaped the war's trajectory. The Dutch Republic provided loans and engaged Britain in naval conflicts, further stretching British resources. Russia and other nations formed the League of Armed Neutrality, challenging Britain's dominance of global trade routes. The global consequences of this foreign involvement were profound. The revolution widened into a world war, straining Britain's finances and military commitments across multiple continents. More importantly, the American victory, achieved with foreign aid, inspired revolutionary movements abroad. The French Revolution of 1789 drew heavily from American ideals, while independence struggles in Latin America later echoed the example of the United States. Thus, the revolution was not merely a local uprising. It was a global event, reshaping international politics and proving that empires could be challenged successfully. The Treaty of Paris, 1783, was the final and formal end to the American Revolutionary War, securing independence for the United States and reshaping the global balance of power. Negotiated in Paris by American representatives Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay, along with Britain's envoy, Richard Oswald, the treaty not only marked the triumph of the Patriot cause, but also set the stage for a new era of international relations. Negotiations began in 1782 after the decisive American and French victory at Yorktown, which had convinced Britain that the war was unwinnable. Yet, Britain still sought to protect its global empire, while the Americans aimed to secure independence, territorial expansion, and recognition as a sovereign state. Despite the alliance with France, the American negotiators acted with strategic independence, at times dealing directly with Britain to secure the best possible terms for their new nation. The treaty's terms were highly favorable to the United States. Britain formally recognized the independence of the 13 colonies, creating the United States of America. The new nation's boundaries extended westward to the Mississippi River, north to Canada, and south to Spanish Florida. This vast expansion granted the young republic enormous opportunities for growth and settlement. In addition, Americans secured fishing rights off the coast of Newfoundland, ensuring access to valuable resources. Both sides agreed that lawful debts owed to British creditors would be repaid and that confiscated Loyalist property would be returned, though enforcement of these provisions was inconsistent. For Britain, the treaty was both a loss and a recalibration. While it marked the end of Britain's dominance over its most prosperous colonies, it allowed London to refocus on its remaining global empire, particularly in the Caribbean, India, and Canada. France and Spain, America's allies, achieved mixed results. France regained some prestige, but gained little tangible reward, while Spain recovered Florida but failed to reclaim Gibraltar. The war and its conclusion had drained European powers financially, fueling unrest, particularly in France, where the Revolution of 1789 loomed on the horizon. Globally, the Treaty of Paris signaled a new world order. For the first time, a colony had successfully broken free from the control of a European empire and established an independent nation founded on Enlightenment principles of liberty and self-government. This success inspired revolutionary movements worldwide, from Haiti to Latin America, and encouraged debates over the rights of citizens, the role of governments, and the legitimacy of colonial rule. For the United States, the treaty marked both a triumph and a challenge. Independence was secured, but the responsibility of nation-building now rested on fragile institutions and a diverse population. The Treaty of Paris thus represented more than peace. It was the foundation of a new political experiment that would test whether the ideals of the revolution could endure in practice. With independence secured by the Treaty of Paris in 1783, the United States faced the daunting task of transforming revolutionary ideals into a stable government. The first attempt came through the Articles of Confederation. Adopted in 1781, the Articles created a loose confederation of states, united under a weak central government with limited powers. While it successfully guided the nation through the final years of the war and negotiated important treaties, it soon became clear that the system was flawed. The national government lacked authority to levy taxes, regulate commerce, or enforce laws, leaving it unable to address economic turmoil, interstate disputes, or foreign threats effectively. Recognizing the weaknesses, delegates convened in Philadelphia in 1787 for the Constitutional Convention. Rather than revising the Articles, they drafted an entirely new framework, the U.S. Constitution. This document established a stronger federal government with separate executive, legislative, and judicial branches, balancing authority between the states and the central government. A system of checks and balances ensured that no single branch could dominate, while federalism allowed for shared power between states and the nation. Debates over ratification were fierce. Federalists supported the Constitution as essential for unity and stability, while anti-federalists feared it would threaten individual liberties. To address these concerns, the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, was adopted in 1791. These guaranteed fundamental freedoms, such as speech, religion, press, and assembly, while protecting individuals against government abuses. Together, the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights marked the evolution of American governance from fragile independence to a durable republic. They laid the foundation for a political system rooted in representation, liberty, and the rule of law, principles that continue to shape the United States and influence democratic movements worldwide. The American Revolution was more than a war for independence. It was a transformative event that reshaped political thought, fostered national identity, and laid the foundations for the United States to eventually emerge as a global superpower. Its legacy resonates not only in American history, but in the broader development of democracy and self-determination worldwide. One of the revolution's most enduring legacies was the advancement of democracy. Though limited in its early application, excluding women, enslaved Africans, and Native Americans, the revolution established the principle that governments derive legitimacy from the consent of the governed. The Declaration of Independence proclaimed natural rights to liberty. Over time, these ideals expanded to include broader groups of people, fueling future reform movements such as abolition, women's suffrage, and civil rights. The revolution thus planted the seeds of democratic governance that became a model for other nations seeking freedom. Equally important was the rise of nationalism. Before 1776, the colonies identified more with their local regions than with each other. The shared struggle against Britain created a sense of unity and common purpose. Figures such as George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson became national icons, embodying the collective spirit of independence. Patriotism was expressed through symbols like the American flag and anthems such as Yankee Doodle, while victories on the battlefield fostered pride in the new nation's resilience. This emerging national identity helped the United States weather the challenges of its early years, from economic hardship to political division. The Revolution also marked the birth of America as a future superpower. Though the United States was initially weak, rural, and vulnerable, independence allowed it to control vast lands stretching to the Mississippi River. This territorial foundation, combined with ideals of self-government and economic opportunity, set the stage for expansion and growth. The revolution's success inspired confidence that the United States could stand among the world's great powers. Moreover, foreign recognition, particularly by France, placed the nation on the global stage. In the long term, the revolution's impact extended beyond America. It inspired revolutionary movements in France, Haiti, and Latin America, proving that monarchies and empires could be challenged. America's experiment in democracy became a beacon for oppressed peoples, even as contradictions, such as the persistence of slavery, remained unresolved. By the 19th and 20th centuries, the United States would harness the legacy of independence, its vast resources, and its democratic institutions to rise as an industrial, military, and cultural superpower. Ultimately, the revolution's legacy lies in its dual achievement: securing independence and enshrining ideals that transcended its time. Democracy, nationalism, and the foundations of future strength were born in its struggle. The revolution was not the end of America's story. It was the beginning of a nation destined to shape the modern world. The American Revolution's influence extended far beyond the borders of the 13 colonies, reshaping political thought and inspiring revolutionary movements across the globe. Its success proved that colonial subjects could challenge powerful empires and establish new nations founded on ideals of liberty and self-government. The first and most immediate impact was felt in France. French support for the American cause had been decisive in securing victory, but the financial burden of war deepened France's economic crisis. More importantly, American ideals of freedom and equality energized French intellectuals and reformers. Within a decade, France erupted in its own revolution, 1789, adopting the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, which echoed Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. The French Revolution would be bloodier and more radical, but it drew clear inspiration from the American struggle. In Latin America, the revolution provided both inspiration and a model for independence. Leaders like Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín saw in the American experience proof that European rule could be broken. Throughout the early 19th century, revolutionary movements swept across South America, Central America, and the Caribbean, with rebels citing the United States as a precedent. The Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, in particular, demonstrated how the language of liberty could inspire enslaved peoples to claim freedom and nationhood. Beyond Europe and the Americas, the revolution influenced debates in Asia and Africa as well. Though independence from colonial powers would not come for much longer, the American example planted the notion that empires were not invincible. Thus, the American Revolution was not just a national event, but a global turning point. It launched an age of revolutions, spreading the ideals of liberty, equality, and self-determination across continents, forever altering the trajectory of world history. The American Revolution was more than a war of independence. It was the foundation of a new nation destined to rise as a global power. By defeating the world's strongest empire, the 13 colonies proved that determination, unity, and ideals could overcome military might. The revolution established the principles of representative government, constitutional order, and individual rights, values that would guide the United States' political, social, and economic development. Equally important, the revolution secured vast territories and set the stage for westward expansion, fueling growth in population, agriculture, and trade. It also introduced a spirit of innovation and self-reliance, laying the groundwork for industrial and technological progress in the centuries to come. Internationally, the revolution demonstrated that empires could be challenged, inspiring revolutions in France, Latin America, and beyond. While the young republic faced contradictions, slavery, inequality, and political division, the ideals born in the revolution provided a framework for continual reform. Over time, these foundations allowed the United States not only to survive, but to thrive, transforming into a nation capable of projecting influence on a global scale. Thus, the revolution was not the end of colonial rule, but the beginning of America's rise toward leadership, liberty, and eventual global dominance.